In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace the hydraulic brake booster on a Chevy Express van, commonly referred to as the hydroboost unit. My van is a 2011 GMC Savana 3500, and my friend's van is a 2012 Chevy Express 2500. Under hood, they're identical. I've seen a lot of posts from van lifers paying mechanics to do simple things like serpentine belts, oil changes, and brakes. So I've decided to start a playlist on my channel and make videos of maintenance and repairs to Chevy vans to maybe give people some confidence to do these things themselves and save hundreds of dollars. So if you want to work on your own van, my first recommendation for you is to go get one of these. You can get them at O'Reilly or Amazon. They're about 30 bucks. I use them primarily for wiring diagrams, torque specs, and fluid capacities, but they also have step-by-step how-tos on a lot of repairs. So what I think scares a lot of people when they pop the hood on their van is you can't really see anything. Like, you can't get to any of the, you can barely even see the engine, you know. But it's actually really easy to access what you need to get to. You just have to remove the airbox, the fan shroud, and the overflow tank for the coolant. And I'll show you that right now. It's not necessarily required for this repair, but I'm gonna do it anyway. So all of the bolts are 10 millimeter. If you don't own one, go buy a mechanic's tool set. I use a Craftsman. You can get them anywhere though, any hardware store or auto parts store even. Just something that has sockets in 3/8 and 1/2 inch drive and maybe a few wrenches. I also recommend getting a magnet bowl. You can throw the bolts in it so you don't lose them. So for the airbox, there's just two 10 millimeter bolts here. And you unhook the mass air sensor plug right here. And then down here on the throttle body is a hose clamp. You can get that with just a flathead screwdriver. And the bolt's facing up on this one, so I'm using a short screwdriver, also called a stubby. You just loosen it up. Then there's another little hose on the side right here. You just pop that out. And then the whole thing pops up and out. The next thing you'll do is move the coolant overflow tank out of the way. Again, it's just a 10 millimeter. And this, you just slide it out of the firewall up here and just kind of move it out of your way like that. That way you don't have to disconnect it and spill coolant everywhere. And then the last thing you want to remove to get to anything, say you're doing a serpentine belt or a water pump or a pulley or anything with the engine, is the top half of the fan shroud, which again is just 10 millimeter. There's two bolts up here on the radiator support, and then there's 6 bolts on the sides that connect the two halves of the fan shroud together. They are also 10 millimeter. For those, you're going to want some extensions. A lot of all-in-one mechanic tool sets only come with a couple extensions, typically a 3-inch like this and a 6-inch. And for these, it's better to have like 12 inches of extension. So just go purchase either an extension assortment. You can buy like a few of them in a package, or just get an additional 6-inch extension. And if you look down on the sides of the fan shroud, you'll see that there's 3 bolts on each side that connect the two pieces together. None of these bolts are very tight. They're small bolts. General rule of thumb when you're working on a vehicle is the smaller the bolt, physical size of the bolt, the less tight it needs to be. If you're unsure of how tight to tighten a bolt, you can go by what's called a torque wrench. You adjust the wrench to however many inch-pounds or foot-pounds, depending on the size. And then when you tighten it, it will click, telling you when to stop. And you can get all of those torque specs in that Haynes manual that I showed you. The reason that I'm replacing this hydroboost module or brake booster is because it leaks. I already replaced the steering lines because they leaked, and then about a month later this started leaking. The GM hydroboost is a brake booster that uses the hydraulic steering pump to give it power, as opposed to other vehicles who use a vacuum booster, which uses your engine's vacuum and a large diaphragm in there to give you power brakes. That's why if you have a Chevy van with hydroboost, every time you step on the brakes, it makes that steering sound, the same steering pump sound as when you turn the wheel. These bolts can be a little tricky down here. One thing you need to kind of teach yourself to do is not drop them. If you have poor dexterity in your fingers, you could get an extendable magnet, which is a good thing to have in general for working on vehicles. Something like this, it's just a magnet on a stick. You can reach down into areas and pick up a bolt. So now all the bolts are loose on the upper fan shroud. This also holds the radiator in place. The next thing you need to do is unhook this battery cable and this coolant hose from the fan shroud itself. They just have these little plastic clips here. All you need for that is a small flathead screwdriver. You just get in there and pop the tabs on them. This one's already loose for the coolant. And now the tricky part is just finagling this thing out of here. And I really have no advice for you on that, except move your upper radiator hose past the fan shroud, lift up. There's also a air conditioning line here. Just move them out of the way. You kind of want to go up and then over towards the driver's side of the van. Be careful of the fins on your radiator so you don't smash them and cause a leak. There you go. And now there's a ton of room in here and you can see the whole front of the engine. I'll show you. As you can see, we have everything accessible now. If you want to change your serpentine belt, now you can. That's easy to do. I'll probably show you that. In this van, I changed the radiator, the water pump, the belt, the pulleys, the radiator hoses, and the steering lines already. I should have made videos of that, but the thought had not yet occurred to me to do so. But I will make a video of how to do that. Alright, so in that Haynes manual, for this specific repair, it says the one step to do is to pump the brakes with the engine off to relieve the pressure in the booster. Now, a general piece of advice for working on a vehicle is if something's in your way, like you can't get to a bolt or whatever you're trying to remove, if something's in your way, remove it or just move it out of the way. I'm going to move this steering reservoir. It's just two 10mm nuts on the firewall here, and we can just kind of get it out of the way or at least get it movable. I'm using a deep well socket. There's short well and deep well. It just depends on what you're doing, which one you need. And on modern GM vehicles, a 10, a 13, and a 15 is the most common sizes for like everything. Until you get into suspension or like engine bolts that are, you know, larger sizes. Then there's 17s, 18s. 18 is also the same as 3/4. The next thing I'll do is unbolt the brake master cylinder from the brake booster. Those are 15. And here, my deep well is sort of required because it's a nut on a bolt stud. However, it's going to make my ratchet interfere with this on this side and the brake line on the other side. So I'll go get a 15mm wrench. Here I've got a ratcheting wrench. These are pretty handy. Alright, this is a nylock. It's a nylon lock nut. It has nylon in the nut to keep it from coming loose. And on the back there's a bolt that I just noticed, and it's spinning. And that looks like a smaller size, potentially a 13. So we need to get a 13 wrench on the back side to hold the bolt while we loosen the nut. There we go. I'm actually a little surprised by that. Typically that would be a stud pressed in there. There's one. We got one on this side now. You can just sort of play around with your tools to figure out what works best for every situation. Any combination of sockets, extensions, wrenches, whatever you got. Just experiment till you find what makes it possible. So on this side I couldn't get my wrench in there very easily. So now I'm using a 3-inch extension, a wobble adapter, and a deep well socket with a wrench on the back side. With the nylon lock nuts, they're pretty much tight the entire way until you get them off the bolt. That's the whole point. Okay. Now we can get the brake master cylinder out of the way. And there's a wire connector here on the reservoir. This is a low brake fluid warning sensor. And it's too short, so we're going to go ahead and pop that off. You just use like a flathead screwdriver. Gently pry the tab. Don't go crazy with it or it'll break. Alright, now we can move that out of the way. They purposefully made it flexible right there so you can All right, now this thing is leaking like crazy, and that's steering fluid, not brake fluid. So the next thing we'll do is pull the hose from the steering reservoir off of here. These have a crimp-on hose clamp. What you can do for those is either take long nose pliers or a flathead screwdriver, and you just kind of pry it to uncrimp it. Spread it apart, basically. Now we can pop that off. And you want to try to kind of keep it from leaking everywhere. Like, don't let the hose fall down, otherwise steering fluid will get all over. We're just going to move that out of the way, and then I'm going to just kind of stick it up behind these wires up here on the firewall so it stays put. Now we've got pretty good access to this thing. The next thing we need to do is remove the steering lines that I installed like a month ago. And replacing these steering lines with all of this still in place, all the stuff we just removed, is very difficult to do. I'll show you the wrench that you'll want to buy if you're doing just the steering lines to be able to loosen these up. These are right angle specialty wrenches. I got these from Harbor Freight, and they allow you to get in here when you have a weird angle to be able to loosen up stuff like this. I actually don't have the right size for these. I didn't use these when I did it, but this is definitely going to make your life easier if you're just doing your steering lines. What I used is one of these crazy guys, and I don't think they make them anymore, but they're kind of a weird open-ended ratcheting wrench. Not really the correct tool for the job, but they worked for me. And once you break these loose, you can pretty much spin them off with your fingers. They use a O-ring to seal them. Helps to wiggle the line as you're trying to unscrew it with your fingers because the threads can bind. That's a good rule of thumb for pretty much any like line or hose, brake lines, fuel lines, stuff like that. Once you break them loose and you're to the point where you're using your fingers, just kind of wiggle on it as you're going. All right, so we're pretty much halfway done with removal already. Everything under the hood has been disconnected. So now we need to go under the dash. There's 4 bolts bolting this to the van through the firewall, and then there's the rod that connects your brake pedal to the booster. On these Chevy vans, it's extremely easy to access everything under the dash right here. You don't have to take the dash apart, you don't have to take the doghouse off or any of that. And all you need to do this under here, from what I can tell anyway, is a 10mm and a 15. So as you can see, you've got your 4 bolts holding that thing on, and then you have your brake pedal, which connects to it. There is a 10mm bolt right here that I think you have to either loosen up or remove completely. There's a clip here that holds this rod on that connects the brake pedal to the booster. And then this over here is your brake light switch. when you press the brake pedal, it turns this switch. And either my friend or some mechanic added this little piece of tape here. They must have had an issue with the brake light switch not connecting all the time or something. But I'm going to start by removing this 10mm bolt and popping this clip out, and then this piece here should be able to just slide right off. All right, it's real difficult for me to get my phone in here to show you what I'm doing, and I apologize for the flickering light. But for this bolt right here, you need to hold this clip with one hand while you take this bolt out with the other hand. Because once you get the bolt unthreaded from the rod here, the whole clip spins. And you need that to stay steady while you undo that bolt. Then, what you need to do is pry the bottom of the clip out past that piece. I don't know if I can do this with one hand. Trying to demonstrate for you. Pry that out past that piece, like that, and then push it up and off. Then you can pull the rod off and the brake pedal just, you know, it's free. And then all you have to do after that is unbolt these 4 bolts to remove the unit from the van. Okay, so a 15mm deep wall socket and a 6-inch extension seems to be the winning combination here. Alright, we're halfway done. As those manuals frequently say, installation is reverse of removal, but I will show you every step. Right now I'm just wiping up everything. With that out of the way, I can access the surrounding area. If you are fixing a leak, clean up the whole area. Try to get as much of whatever that leaked out away from the area or off the van entirely. That way you can see if it still leaks when you're done. If you're fixing an oil leak on your engine, like your oil pan gasket or something like that, it helps to really clean up the whole bottom side of the van. Then you can tell if something still leaks. You can check it every few days and put eyes on it. And like at first glance, it looks like this master cylinder for the brake leaks from the back, but his brake fluid level never changes, but the steering fluid runs out. So we know that's the issue. Also, if you're doing this particular repair, replacing the brake booster, do not, under any circumstances, disconnect your brake lines or any of this. You want to keep this all together and just move it out of the way as one unit. If you can't distinguish your steering lines from your brake lines, then take it to a mechanic. Don't try this repair unless you are absolutely confident that you can do it. I will make a video on how to change your brakes among other things. But we're not touching the brake fluid itself, we're just doing steering fluid. All right, now you stick the new one right back in the hole. You kind of figure out the orientation of it. This is up, just like the old one was. Always kind of pay attention to what stuff looks like before you remove it. That way you put it in right. So now I'm going to put those 4 15mm nuts back on this and then rehook up that pin down there. I'll show you when I'm done. It's really hard to film under there. All right, I bolted it to the firewall. I put the rod back on the brake pedal and put the clip on, which was all very easy to do. The last thing I need to do under there is put this little bolt back in. On this bolt, they have, it looks like some sort of silicone or adhesive to keep it tight. I'm going to scrape this off of the bolt without damaging the threads, of course, and then put some Loctite on that, because this is kind of a important safety thing to make sure this bolt never comes out. Because if that rod comes off of your brake pedal, you have no brakes. You have your emergency parking brake. But this is kind of a safety thing right here. You just need to make sure this bolt never comes out. I've got Loctite thread locker. There's the blue and the red. The blue is just like a removable version and the red is more of a permanent one. For this tiny little bolt, I'm going to go ahead and probably just use the blue. Red would be safer, but with how tiny the bolt is, if someone ever needed to remove this again with the red on it, it would probably break. All right, all that's hooked up underneath. The next step is to hook the steering lines back up to the booster. I'm going to just put these on because they're new. However, if you have older steering lines, you need to check your O-rings on here. If they become damaged or torn, then you need to replace them. And when you do that, just go to the auto parts store and get the correct kind. There's different colors, there are different types of rubber. These are green, so you want to get green ones. To get them back on, again, you'll have to probably do some wiggling. And you want to be careful not to cross thread the threads on there. Always start this stuff by hand with your fingers. This is probably the most tricky part, is doing these steering lines, because they are sort of in a difficult spot. Once you get them threaded as far as you can with your fingers, then you can come in with the wrench and tighten them up. They make line wrenches too, specific for doing stuff like this, which are basically a wrench, an open-end wrench that goes around a little bit further. It has a couple extra teeth on it, which is made for, they're called line wrenches or tube nut wrenches. And these don't need to be super, super tight. You want them tight, but you'll feel when it bottoms out in there. And you'll know it's tight when you grab the line and it doesn't move after, it doesn't move on its own, you know. Next, we'll put the steering reservoir hose back on. with these crimp style hose clamps. If you damage it while removing it and you're not confident that you can get it tight again, just pull that off of there and go get another hose clamp, the screw-on style. Those work just fine. For this, I have a special pair of pliers that's made for these, but you can probably get it tight with just some needle nose pliers. Now we'll put that back on with the two 10mm nuts and hold it to the firewall. I also replaced this steering reservoir because the bottom of it was rusted out. But it's very easy to do. As you can see, it's only two 10mm nuts and two hoses. Now we put the master cylinder back on. Slide it right over the bolts. They came with, the brake booster came with new bolts. Going to reuse the same nuts. We'll get them started and then put the 13mm wrench on the back and use a 15mm on the front. For this one, now I'm trying a 6-inch extension with the wobble adapter and a deep well socket. That seems to be giving me a little more articulation with the ratchet. All right, those are now tight. And we're going to re-hook up the connector for the brake fluid level sensor. Just like that. So now the next step is to fill the power steering fluid we didn't really lose a lot. I'm just going to add a little for now, and then after we put the fan shroud and everything else back together, we'll start the van and I'll show you how to bleed the system and check your fluid level. All right, home stretch. Now we got to put the radiator shroud back on. I'm gonna just kind of tuck these couple of lines, hoses out of the way. Maybe. Getting this on can be kind of difficult. Just kind of hold the radiator back. You got to kind of just snake it in there, you know. These rubber things on here go around the tops of the where the reservoir meets the coil on the radiator. So you want to sort of line that up first. And then down here, there's actually two little plastic nubs on the top half of the shroud that go into holes on the bottom half to line all that up. Then you can put the bolts in. And it's easy to get them lined up. You just kind of move the plastic around till those things fall into place. Now we'll put the bolts in. Helps to start them with your fingers. Otherwise, you'll just drop them on the ground if you try to put it on with the socket. Or if you're having difficulty doing that, you can use a magnet stick to at least drop the bolt down into the hole. And then again, I'm using two 6-inch extensions. And these, you just want them snug. You don't gotta torque them. They just go into little clips that retain the bolt. Threaded clips. This fan shroud and the airbox and the coolant reservoir and all that is designed to be removed dozens of times over the life of the van. Now you pull it back, line up the holes on the radiator support, put these bolts in. You see how these are cracked? That's from people torquing them too tight over the years. Now we take the radiator hose, get it kind of back into place, put it in its retaining clip here. And that clip is broke. I didn't do that. And this AC line just kind of sits in front of that. One mistake I just made, which is easy to do, is before you put these bolts in, you need to grab that battery cable that runs along the top of this and put it into place. That's a simple mistake. I'm sure many people before me have done the same thing. This is your mass airflow sensor. If you run the van with this not hooked up, you will get a check engine light. Just kind of get it over the throttle body. Get it on there as straight as you can. Put this little hose on the side here. Just kind of stick it in its hole. Tighten up this hose clamp down here. If you're struggling to do that with the flathead, you can use, I think, an 8mm. If you buy hose clamps from the hardware store, they're generally 5/16, but the factory ones on most vehicles are a metric size. reconnect your plug. And then there's two little rubber grommets. You want to put these in the bottom of the airbox, or make sure they're still in there. Sometimes one of them will stick to the fan shroud as you remove them. Just using a flat head to kind of push it in there. And then you line these up with the two holes on the fan shroud. And it snaps in just like that. And then you put your bolts in here. Go ahead and take your steering or your coolant overflow tank. Put these tabs in the slots on the firewall. Line up the hole there. Put the bolt in. And then this overflow hose, there's actually a little spot on the fan shroud that it sits in. You'll see down there. It's just a little groove. Just kind of snap it into that. And we're done. So now we need to start the van, take the cap off of this, check the level, and then we'll bleed the system. Now we're visually checking for leaks. Looks good. It's okay to run your engine and remove the steering reservoir cap. The first thing I'll do is I'll turn the wheels all the way from one side to the other a couple times. That will bleed out the steering side of the system. And then we're going to press the brake pedal several times slowly to bleed out the booster. All right, I pressed the brake pedal like 8 times and turned the wheels back and forth several times. The level has dropped and there's now a bunch of air bubbles in it. Those air bubbles will work their way out. We're going to add more fluid now. I'm pressing it down and just holding it. That should help work the air out. The pedal does feel good. Turn the wheels some more. Steering feels good, brakes feel good. The air bubbles are working their way out. It doesn't look as foamy anymore. Just continue doing what I'm doing until it looks good, and then shut it off, put the cap back on, and call it a day. Alright, so the last thing you want to do is just check everywhere for leaks. Go over all your connections, hoses, and everything, and just make sure nothing's dripping. Wipe it all with the rag real good, and then check it, periodically over the course of about a week. And if you don't see any spots under the van that you know are from the steering system, or nothing that you've touched during this repair is leaking, then you know you're good to go. And this will be the first of many videos that I'm going to make about how to work on a Chevy van. If you have a Ford, these videos won't really apply to you, but a lot of general practices and skills with tools and working on cars applies to every make and model. So if you got anything out of this video, consider subscribing, and there'll be plenty more where this came from. On my van, I'm going to do a full tune-up on the engine and the cooling system. I might replace my water pump just because. I will show you all of that. I'm going to do plugs. I'm going to check the coils. I'm going to do all the brakes all around and the entire suspension because I'm putting a lift on it. So I'll show you tie rods, pitman arm, idler arm, maybe the ball joints, springs, etc., shocks. So yeah, thanks for watching, and stay tuned for the next how to work on your Chevy van video.